Skwe, hello and good afternoon, and welcome to Cycle's event as part of the Climate Change Month series, Smudging in Sharm El-Sheikh, Experiences from Indigenous Peoples at COP27. Professor Angele Alook and Dr. Graeme discussed their experiences attending the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties, or COP27, at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was held in Egypt. COP27 heralded in implementation, COP saw the greatest number of Indigenous peoples representatives since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Despite the growing representation, discussion texts referring to Indigenous peoples decline compared to COP26 in Glasgow. Drs. Alook and will unpack this reality, describing more about participating in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, key negotiation and political outcomes for Indigenous peoples, and outlining some of the tensions of showing up as Indigenous peoples in a non-Indigenous colonial process. With the presentation today ending with some updates on their research focuses, which is focused on uplifting Indigenous self-determined climate leadership. We'll begin today's meeting with a territorial acknowledgement. As this meeting is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As members of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of our institution. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We note that this territory is subject to the Just One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. This land acknowledgement is the beginning of responsibilities that are incumbent upon York University administrators, our faculty, and our staff, as well as our students. So my name is Sean Hillier. I'm a Mi'kmaq scholar from the Halapu First Nation and associate professor in the School of Health Policy and Management. I hold a York Research Chair in Indigenous Health Policy and am the current director for the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages. We're proud to be hosting today's event. We'll be conducting a moderated Q&A session to start off our event today, and then we'll take some time at the end to take questions for those of you who have joined us online. I ask that you please turn off your cameras and keep yourself muted unless you're called upon to ask a question. Alternatively, you can drop your questions or comments in the chat as we'll be monitoring those throughout the event today. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Dr. Natalie Lacoste-Ling, the cycle coordinator, for putting this event together today. We have two panelists joining us today to talk about their experiences. The first, Dr. Angele Alook, is an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies here at York University. She's a proud member of the Big Stone Cree Nation in Treaty 8 territory, where she has carried out research on issues of sociology of family and work, resource extraction, school-to-work transitions, Indigenous identity, and seeking the good life, or Mi'opawatsuen, in work-life balance. Her current research examines a just transition away from fossil fuels. She's an active member of the labor movement and a former labor researcher in the movement. And I would note that I got to spend yesterday afternoon with Angele during her book launch of this fantastic new book that just came out, The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada. So if you haven't yet done so, I highly encourage you to go out, purchase this book, and have a read. It certainly will add a significant amount of context, I think, to some of the discussion that we'll be having today. So congratulations to Angele and her team. Our second panelist is Dr. Graeme. Graeme is a postdoctoral fellow here at York University and is a senior policy advisor with the Assembly of First Nations, or the AFN, where he advocates for the inclusion of First Nations in the federal, provincial, and territorial climate change and energy policy dialogue. He also recently completed his doctorate from the University of Guelph in 2002, studying the intersection of Indigenous governance, environmental governance, and the climate crisis. His thesis, entitled Indigenous Climate Futures, Developing Innovative Visions for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, explores how Indigenous solutions can generate self-determined futures in the face of catastrophic change. In addition to this research, He is keenly involved in the mobilization of knowledge, including as coordinating lead author of the Indigenous Resilience Report in the National Climate Assessment, and is co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He is an Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes with mixed ancestry from England, Scotland, and Germany. Welcome to the both of you, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us. And so with that, we'll get started with our questions. And the first question is directed to both of you to please introduce yourself and share your experiences and positionality at COP. And we'll start with Graeme.
Yeah, awesome. Miigwech, Sean, for this. Really honored to be joining this virtual space from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, what's currently known as Vancouver. Anim Bojo, Graeme Reid, Anishtikaz, Ottawa, Nunjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dao. I grew up in Ottawa, and as Sean shared, had English and Scottish heritage on my dad's side, and German and Anishinaabe, specifically from Okwimikong on Manitoulin Island. You know, I've been participating in the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for about 5.5 years now, and started attending intersessional meetings, which are the technical meetings that take place in June in 2017, and have since been participating for a long time since then. Been to 5 COPs, as was indicated, and I'm planning to attend COP 28 this year in Dubai. In those contexts, I wear a few different hats. So I do this within the context of my role at the Assembly of First Nations and support First Nations leadership, First Nations elders, women, and kind of other young people in these conversations. But then I also play a role with the Global Caucus, the caucus being the representative body of Indigenous peoples from the 7 UN sociocultural regions. And so since 2019, have played a co-chair role in that caucus, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. A lot of that has been, how do we support the growing representation of Indigenous peoples? We'll talk a little bit about what that representation looked like at COP27, and how do we create space for them, including through the hosting of different Indigenous peoples pavilions, and have had the opportunity and privilege of helping organize the last 3 of those and the events that we helped put forward. I also just participate on a constituted body. Constituted body are one of the technical bodies that take place under some of the subsidiary bodies. It's called the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. The Facilitative Working Group is actually the first body across the UN where Indigenous peoples, through their regional processes, can appoint themselves and appoint their representatives. So there are 7 Indigenous representatives from those 7 regions. Each of those regions appointed their own respective expert, technician, etc. Had the opportunity to be appointed that. Originally, my co-chair, or I guess alternate, was Chris Honani, who's Dene. Chris unfortunately walked on earlier this year. Very powerful young man, and has subsequently been replaced by Janine Yazzie, another Dene expert from the Southwest region in the US. So, you know, those multiple hats, I guess, are the ways in which I show up within these spaces, and then the ways in which you leverage the work here domestically in that context. So miigwech, and really looking forward to this discussion.
Great, thank you, Graeme. Angele.
Yeah, so I first started attending the COP meetings in 2019 at COP25 in Madrid, Spain. I was attending as part of the Ringo constituency with a delegation from York University led by Dawn Baisley and Adele Boran. So a call out went out at York University asking people to join the delegation. Ringo, the constituency that we were part of, stands for researchers and independent NGOs. So the first time I attended COP, I attended as a researcher. And I applied to be on the delegation because my research is on resource extraction, just transition, which touches on climate change, but I wanted to pivot my research more towards climate change. And so the first time I attended, it was just kind of a whirlwind. You know, we had preparatory meetings with the York delegation. They told us there's going to be so many things happening. There's going to be side events, the official negotiations. We're attending as observers and researchers. So as researchers, I felt like we were there to attend a bunch of events to get more information. So I tried to attend like events on Gender Day, on Human Rights Day, you know, to understand things from the perspective of my research interests. And I think on like the second day I was there in Madrid, I ran into Nigel Robinson from Cold Lake First Nation, who was there with Indigenous Climate Action, who I had met at my First Nation at a Keepers of the Waters conference. And he actually stayed over at my family's house, and we, you know, felt like we were relations because we're both from Treaty 8. And he said, "Oh, why aren't you part of the Indigenous Peoples caucus?" And then at the same time, I met Ariel Deranger, and they were like, "You have to come to the Indigenous Peoples caucus tomorrow morning at 9. And I said, "Well, I'm here with Ringo." And they said, "No, you're Indigenous. You need to be with us." So I went the next morning, and I think that's the first time I ever met Graeme. I think he was leading the caucus meetings, the morning meetings. Yeah, so that was my first COP. And while I was there, the Indigenous women wanted a greater voice within the caucus. I think Graeme probably remembers this because he kind of led it, that women wanted to lead some of the discussions with the caucus. So then I joined a group of Indigenous women to write a high-level statement for the COP presidency. And so I got to work with some amazing Indigenous women from South America, from, you know, the African continent, just all over the world writing this statement. And then from there, we wanted to write a position paper on gender and women. So yeah, that was my first COP. The second one I went to was in Glasgow. And that time I went as part of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. I attended as the Indigenous social scientist alongside Indigenous Climate Action. So I attended events with them. They organized actions and protests. So in addition to being involved with official side events at the official COP venue, where I presented my research at the Indigenous Pavilion, and, you know, attending official events, I also attended protests in the city of Glasgow with Indigenous Climate Action and helped, you know, in those processes. And then the last COP that I went to, COP 27, I attended again with the York delegation, but this time knowing that I was going there to really spend all my time within the Indigenous Pavilion. And I went a bit early so that I could attend a preparatory meeting with Indigenous Caucus. And the third time I went, I really went as a researcher, because by this point I had research funding for our project called Indigenous Climate Leadership and Self-Determined Futures. So I went there to talk to and interview youth Indigenous climate leaders and activists. And so I had some pretty amazing conversations with some of the people I've built relationships with along the way. Yeah, so I guess that's been my my COP adventure thus far.
Well, it certainly sounds like it's been an adventure, an exciting one. So this leads into our second question of starting into the meats and bones of the actual event. Reflecting on COP27, can you share with us some of the key outcomes for Indigenous peoples, and then more specifically, how they could relate to the outcomes from COP26? Whoever would like to take that first.
Yeah, no, we good, Sean. I think I was the kind of one to start this conversation, and like really picking up on a lot of the points that Angele shared. You know, I think a broad kind of key outcome of COP27 is the recognition of the growing representation of Indigenous peoples within the COP space, and that's emblematic of why we titled this Smudging in Sharm, is that for the first time there was a dedicated space for ceremony in the UN venue. And so back in Glasgow, we had a bit of an incident with UN security. Some of our young folks were trying to just, you know, smudge and have ceremony outside of the actual formal venue, or within. So essentially within UN venues, there's a fence and there's only one way to get in. And even within the fence, there are a lot of different buildings. So there are a lot of outside areas. So where our young folks were doing their ceremony smudging was outside technically, but not outside of the UN venue. And so there was still a decent amount of problems that arose from that, largely because from the UN security's perspective, like a lot of the structures that they build are temporary and are quite flammable. And so there was concern for that. And so essentially it took a year of negotiation between the Indigenous Peoples constituency and the UNFCCC Secretariat to identify, you know, a specific area for ceremony within the venue, which was kind of on the northern end of the COP27 venue, which was quite large. And Angele will share just kind of a reflection of that space. But I wanted also just to focus on what we characterize in the introduction as the I guess tension between like the growing representation of Indigenous peoples and the way in which that representation translates to, you know, textual outcomes, which is ultimately, you know, what this COP process is about. There are, you know, negotiators from all of the different countries that sit around these square tables. They type up text, they agree upon that text, and then they make declarations according to that. And so in the growing representation context, last year in Glasgow, and then this year in Sharm, there was the first opportunity for us to host a really important activity of that local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, which was called an annual knowledge holders gathering. And this activity was really focused on, like, how do we create space for knowledge holders from the 7 UN sociocultural regions to dialogue amongst one another, exchange experiences, values, worldviews, et cetera, and then communicate that to states. And so in Glasgow, it was the first time that we hosted the gathering. We had, I think, around 27 knowledge holders from the 7 UN sociocultural regions. In Sharm, we had 34 that attended, in addition to all of the other knowledge holders from the Indigenous Peoples delegation and constituency. And so this kind of symbolic reclamation of space, both like physical space, but also like ontological space, in the sense of like we're reclaiming the ability for our people to communicate the ways in which we think about what climate change is, the problems and the solutions associated with that. And so, you know, that was a really, I think, important event in how do we grow that representation of Indigenous peoples and their worldviews, knowledge systems, and rights within these spaces. At COP27, for the first time, there was an Indigenous youth roundtable as well, which had the same idea. How are we creating space for our young people to communicate amongst one another and then communicate those priorities to states? And in both instances, we had a two-part session. We had a closed coordination meeting with our knowledge holders, whether for young people or for other knowledge holders, and then we had the opportunity to communicate that to states. And I really think that's kind of an important way in which we create space within these discussions. Parallel to that, as Angele shared, we had a really prominent and large Indigenous Peoples Pavilion this year, and we're very grateful. The first time we actually funded it through an Indigenous-led philanthropic organization, an organization called the NDN Collective, and really that enabled us to create a space that not only was live streamed and had the ability of folks virtually to participate. It was large enough to have around 60 people in the room basically consistently for the 12 days that we held events. We held around 70 events. We had an elders lounge, we had a office, as well as like a media zone. All of these were thought through the Indigenous Peoples Caucus as ways in which we need to essentially claim space within a process that isn't ours. And so, despite all of those, opportunities for growing representation and reflection of Indigenous peoples and their worldviews, one of the challenges and even the differences between Glasgow and Sharm is how that representation translated into the negotiation rooms. And so there are, in my mind, kind of a reduction of references to Indigenous peoples within these spaces. The Glasgow Climate Pact, which is the political cover text that was shared in Glasgow, had 8 references to Indigenous peoples, including one around uplifting the role of Indigenous peoples in climate action and urging parties, countries to work with Indigenous peoples in their national boundaries, to 2 references in the Sharm cover text, the Sharm implementation plan, that really were just kind of symbolic references. And so it's kind of that interesting translation that we see. Substantively, there were like really big wins in the agreement for the creation of a loss and damage finance facility. Loss and damage being what happens when you can't mitigate or adapt to climate impacts. What do we do? What do we do when we that our island is no longer habitable because of sea level rise? And so the kind of decision that was committed is to create funding for that, for the reality that parties, in particular small island developing states and other states that are facing. The challenge for Indigenous peoples, for instance, is that loss and damage was conventionally a global south to global north problem. Global north, who is responsible for 90+% of historical emissions, needs to provide resources for the global south. The challenge is that Indigenous peoples in the global north, just like First Nations and Inuit folks, have no direct entryway into that conversation. And so we see some of the challenges. Article 6 is another big issue, and I'll just end here. Article 6 being the commitment to the establishment of an international carbon market mechanism, an international carbon trading process. Last year in Glasgow, we, for the
Sorry, Graeme, I think you're freezing. If you could go back.
How much?
Just when you said last year in Glasgow.
Oh yeah, last year in Glasgow, I was just saying, I'll close everything. Just that for the first time we had references to the rights of Indigenous peoples and human rights in the operative text. That's the text that actually directs parties to take action in Article 6, that carbon market mechanism. And this year we didn't see any of those references translated into the operative text. And so it's just interesting to see how that that had happened, and how, you know, despite that growing representation, we haven't necessarily translated that into, you know, sustaining the advocacy that the Indigenous Peoples Caucus brings to this space.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, very interesting. That's what I was kind of taking away. It's like we're seeing greater representation, but in some ways, the impact of kind of the outward products are kind of less so. Angele, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I noticed at this COP was definitely a larger Indigenous presence, but there was also a very big youth presence, and I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Yeah, these are a bunch of the Indigenous youth that were there. There was a youth panel that day, and we took some photos afterwards. This is a photo of the Indigenous pavilion that Graeme was talking about. But unfortunately, there was also some talks at the Canadian pavilion. Well, unfortunately, I guess there was also a Canadian pavilion, and, you know, it was there funded by our nation state. And so it was interesting to see the voices and the spaces that were given to people there. It was wonderful that they had a few panels with Indigenous people, like this one that I'm sharing with you about Indigenous voices from the front lines, led by Indigenous women. This was a really great panel. And then there was another panel in the Canadian pavilion with BIPOC youth. And then there was an LGBTQ2+ panel also at the Canadian pavilion, which was pretty amazing because being queer is kind of outlawed in Egypt. So to have that panel was pretty amazing. But unfortunately, within the Canadian pavilion, there was a lot of voice given to corporations, and specifically the Pathways Alliance, which is comprised of energy and oil companies. And so it was pretty upsetting to some of the people who, like these Indigenous women who were invited to speak at the Canadian pavilion, to then see corporations being given a spot at the table as parties to the agreement, and also there as like official advisors to the government of Canada. And so one of the actions that I was a part of was, while we had these corporations giving a panel on energy and energy futures, we organized a walkout. So we all went and sat in on their talk, and then we all walked out, and we brought the media with us. And then we had kind of like a media conference to say that we want to kick out all of the big polluters from these spaces, that these spaces should be, you know, given to more civil society people and Indigenous people. And this is something that's been happening at subsequent COP meetings. I think in Glasgow, you know, it came out in the media that there was more oil executives at that COP than representatives from nation states. And so this is something that's kind of been upsetting, is these spaces, they look very, if I can scroll through, this is, those are some actions that were taking place at COP. I just want to share, okay, maybe in none of my images, because I'm mostly taking pictures of Indigenous climate leaders, but it can feel like a very corporate space. Like you'll see this guy in the background here, like there's a lot of suits around, people representing nation states and corporations. And so to be like these Indigenous youth wearing their ribbon skirts and you know, different types of Indigenous clothing and jewelry, and, you know, just being very proudly Indigenous in these spaces, there's a real contrast of like who is who. And so I feel like in these spaces, you really know like where the power is. And the power is definitely with the corporations and the nation states. And I think that's why we need to continue inviting more Indigenous people to these venues to give more voice and power to Indigenous peoples, especially our youth and our elders. I think I've kind of gotten off track as to what I was trying to say. But yeah, it's an interesting like physical space to be in. Like I was really excited to go to some of these just transition talks at the International Labor Organizations pavilion, and they ended up being very much led by corporate voices, nation states, union leaders. And there was a real, I felt like tokenism of racialized people, global South folks, Indigenous folks at some of these more corporate organized events. So yeah, it's an interesting experience. I'm going to pause there because I'm getting off track, but yeah, just wanted to share that.
Which, thank you for sharing those. And I think you kind of went off track, but on track onto the next question. So it's a great segue in, and maybe I'll toss it over to Graeme to start. But really answering the question of what is it like being Indigenous in these spaces in this specific location, and what opportunities and tensions exist there overall?
And maybe
Graeme, I think you're freezing.
all right, is it not?
Still, I just thought he was looking very studious.
Yeah, I'll turn my camera off if maybe that makes it easier for him. I don't know if that makes a difference.
Angele, why don't we toss to you while Graeme sorts out his internet?
Yeah, there was actually one thing I had written down that I wanted to say about your previous question, and which kind of leads to the next question of why we call this event today Smudging in Sharm El-Sheikh. And it goes to this idea of like, you know, being Indigenous in these spaces as well. So, you know, at one of the early days at COP27, we could really, how can I say this? I was with a bunch of Indigenous women and youth who had been invited to speak on different panels, which is also a lot of emotional work and intellectual work to explain Indigenous knowledges in these venues. And so we had all just had a very long day. And the Indigenous folks that attend these events are up at like 6 a.m. and at the venue until like 7 p.m. sometimes. Like they're organizing with people back home, they're organizing with the Indigenous caucus, they're organizing their own events, sometimes they're organizing actions. They're coordinating with people from all over the world, which requires translators. So in addition to like the emotional exhaustion of just constantly being that emotional voice, there's a lot of like on the ground work, a lot of intellectual work. And so at one of these the early days there, I think like the second or third day, we had a sharing circle where we smudged out in the grass at the venue. Maybe about like 12 Indigenous youth and elders and activists. And, you know, we didn't have anywhere to put our smudge. So we actually used like someone's mint container, and we opened it up and we put the smudge in there. And that's how we burnt it. And somebody had medicine, so we had the medicine, and we wanted to do a talking circle, and someone had like a gukum scarf. So we passed around this gukum scarf as we just kind of went through like what that day meant to us in our spirits and our hearts. And it was a very spiritual moment for us to smudge together, to create that space of community. Because some people are traveling internationally for the first time away from their communities and families. And so to have that Indigenous space there to smudge and to thank Mother Earth and to pray and to share your story from that day, it was very meaningful. And it was just a very spiritual experience to have while being at COP. So, you know, that's also why we call today Smudging at Sharm, because I had that experience, and it's just such a great sense of community when you're there, because, you know, like I was saying, you might be the only person from your community, from your organization. Some organizations bring teams, but oftentimes it's just like, you know, imagine being a 22-year-old or a 65-year-old traveling for the first time away from your community to tell the story of your community and bring it to this international venue. So that's why it was really important to smudge that day. But in addition to that, I just wanted to share that, you know, one great thing that happens in this kind of sense of community there among the Indigenous people is that you really feel a respect for the roles of elders and youth as knowledge keepers. And there's a real respect of the Indigenous knowledges from around the world and the uniqueness to these knowledges in localized spaces, but also sometimes the similarities. And there's a real kinship, I feel, that happens. So yeah, I wanted to share that as well. There's also, you know, tensions that exist. I'm going to share another story really quick. At COP25 in Glasgow, I was going with a delegation of Indigenous youth to a panel on hydropower, where a young Indigenous woman with disabilities, whose community had been negatively impacted by hydropower in Canada, where she was invited to come and speak. So we got to the panel, and this European man said, "Sorry, you're not on the list." And she said, "No, I've been invited. Here's the email." And they were like, "No, sorry, you're not on the list." And, you know, she flew from across the world to tell her story. And eventually it was sorted out. And then me and the older aunties that were there, we were like, you know what? We're just going to walk you to the stage, and we're going to sit you down. We're going to bring you a mic. We're going to bring you water. You wrote this speech that you're going to give. And so we walked with her up to the stage, sat her down, gave her a mic, and we forced her into that space, which she was invited to. And she sat down, she gave her speech. While she was giving her speech, this man from France on the panel, you know, started cutting her off and calling her rude, making her feel uncomfortable. It was very violent verbally. So afterwards, you know, we kind of ushered her out of the room and took her to a safe space. And me and some of the older Indigenous women went up to these men on the panel and said, you know, it's really difficult as Indigenous women to come to these spaces. By the time we've reached this space, we've experienced violence and racism. We already know you don't want us here. We don't feel comfortable here. And then to come to this panel and to make her feel that way and commit that violence towards her, like, that's too much. Like, we've worked so hard to get her here and to get us here and so one of them apologized and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not racist." And then the other one continued being rude to us. But it was a very important story she had to tell, because she was from a region where hydropower has negatively impacted the water and the forest and their relationship to the land and health. So, you know, that's just one example of tensions that can happen, and how we have to act as community when we're there to protect each other, because to have a young person treated like that was just like terrible when we value our young people and their knowledges in our communities. So anyways, that's the story I wanted to share.
Thank you for sharing that impactful story. And continues to go, I think, in many of the international forums that we continue to hear leaders say, oh, we want Indigenous voices, and then how those Indigenous voices are actually taken up and really brought in, and how damaging even kind of the very title of this, of smudging, and the difficulties of doing that, and the complexities of even getting our smudge into certain countries and bringing our ceremonial pieces into countries, and all those types of things are so prohibitive and so difficult, and scary for folks who have never done that. The thought of like, oh, what are the rules of importing, an eagle feather and the paperwork, or those types of things, or what if they detain me, are things that prohibit folks from actually being able to come in a good way and to share. Graeme, I see you're back with us, very, very happy. So over to you.
Yeah, no, miigwech, and sorry for that. This is surprising. It normally doesn't happen. I think like the points that Angele was sharing is really like symbolic of the overall system that we find ourselves in, which is, a combination of like a state sovereignty environment. The UN is essentially predicated on like the erasure of Indigenous nationhood, and we see that manifestation in like how effectively our nations and the representative institutions are downgraded to members of civil society, and we participate as one of 9 constituencies that, as Angele shared, include things like research institutions and business institutions and trade unions. And it's a little bit bizarre that, the kind of position of Indigenous peoples is equated to those other entities that are obviously not the same as the collective and kind of nation-based rights that we have back home. I think it's also just in sharing that most recent story, it shows also just the way in which like the system of colonialism reproduces itself, like whether it's structural violence against like individual Indigenous women within, but like that event is couched within a system that is built on. And like we see that manifest in these different instances,
Sorry, Graeme, you're cutting out again.
And that's video off here.
I think we've lost Graeme again. I think he'll probably drop off the call. Angele, if you'd like to come back, we can come back to kind of Graeme's point when he's able to reconnect with us. But I'll move us into kind of the fourth part of the question, which you started to address, and that is, how do you see Indigenous climate change showing up at the COP? And then I guess second to that is, then how do we see it back here in Canada, whether we think of that Canada as a whole or back in specific territories and places that folks are coming from, and how they're engaging in the outcomes and the responses from COP back within community?
Yeah. So definitely at COP, there's different types of knowledges that are represented. There's a lot of women and elders and youth and, male leaders as well at all levels, from the people participating in the Indigenous Peoples caucus to the Indigenous Pavilion, to people, attending other pavilions and other side events, and then those actively involved in negotiations to, ensure, for example, Indigenous peoples' rights are included in Article 6. And you can really see that within the Indigenous community that ends up forming at COP, that we try to give space to all of these voices. But the people that end up showing up at COP, the Indigenous people, they come from diverse voices, and they're used to speaking up in their communities. And, you know, a lot of the Indigenous folks that I've met at COP are like highly educated, especially like in Western knowledge. There's people I've met with like master's degrees and law degrees in the natural sciences, and the social sciences, and, you know, those that work for their nations or the different levels of government, or different Indigenous organizations. So a lot of like very knowledgeable, highly educated Indigenous people, but also these people who have like a lot of Western knowledge, they also have like a lot of Indigenous knowledges. So they're not just going to university and getting these educations, they're also back home doing land-based learning, being involved in like intergenerational learning in their home territories. And one group that I kind of follow on social media, but I also attended COP25 with Indigenous Climate Action. Like you can see throughout the year that they're involved in activism and research and outreach and teaching, and they hold workshops. And so, you know, these Indigenous folks that end up at COP are just very very knowledgeable in different areas and do a variety of work. Like as a labor researcher, I'm also like very fascinated at the amount of like jobs and tasks some of these folks do, like Graeme, for example, like working with the AFN, working in academia, working as the co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples caucus. Like the other folks that attend COP are also doing like 5 or 10 jobs within their home communities. And so we get, you know, kind of the best of our communities end up showing up there. So it's a really great space to be in. And like, you'll meet people, like I've met, oh my goodness, Willie Little, or what's his name, Little Child, who helped, you know, who everybody talks about from my territory, like from Alberta, that, you know, he's been involved in early negotiations in order to get the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Like I've met elders and leaders like that at the COP venue, and they're just like the most humble, kind elders you'll meet, and they're very knowledgeable in like in different areas, but you'll never know, like you're meeting like a very important person, but within that Indigenous community, they're just there as a person helping.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Graeme. I think you've joined from your phone now.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming back on. So you were in the midst of talking about what is it like being Indigenous within these spaces, and really kind of what opportunities and tensions existed there. So I'll toss it back to you for that, and then we'll, Angele's already answered question 4, but we'll loop you into that as well.
Yeah, and I can probably relate those two together. So really, sorry everyone, not sure what's going on. But I guess I was making the point of tensions associated with showing up in what is like a colonial and violent space, and, you know, some of the challenges that Indigenous peoples face in, you know, trying to make space in a process that isn't ours. And we see, you know, the kind of most recent example of what Angele was sharing earlier is the appointment of the national oil CEO in the UAE to the position of COP president. And, you know, this kind of, I think, like institutionalization of the role in, you know, fossil fuel companies more broadly, in how we think about and articulate what is the climate problem and solution is inherently problematic. On my side, like I'm actually grateful in like kind of one sense of the word, in that like the kind of shadow operation of the fossil fuel industry is now, you know, up front and center. And we heard in the context of Canada, like, you know, Canada is projected currently to produce more oil and gas in 2050 than 2019. Like, we can't be in an environment where Canada does not acknowledge that, and Canada does not acknowledge how that, you know, influences its position at the global scale. And so this like institutional capture that we see is like an inherent tension that manifests in these different ways that, you know, creates violence against our Indigenous participants. You know, for instance, in Madrid, we had like a pretty big fight with like UN security again, because a large number of protesters were pushed out of the venue, including a number of Indigenous youth, and had several nights of negotiations on how to give those youth back their badges. In Egypt, there were 2 Indigenous youth that got up during Biden's statement, yelled at them, and then as, you know, different securities were running towards them, like there was the Secret Service, there was the Egyptian service, and then thankfully, like the UN security got to them first. They took them and kind of shepherded them away from, you know, Egyptian and American security. But again, this is just that different way that all of these things manifest and the problems that they create. And I guess how that relates then to the climate leadership frame is, you know, really like, how are we, and Angele kind of communicated this, how are we creating our alternative parallel spaces for, you know, Indigenous to Indigenous solidarity and Indigenous nations communicating with Indigenous nations? And like, I think that's beginning to take place. How it can within the COP space, you know, the role of the Indigenous Peoples constituency is a major element of that. The role of these knowledge holders gatherings is an element of that. But really, like, how do we take that outside and create our own climate conference, like an Indigenous climate conference that would enable us to, you know, discuss and dialogue our priorities, perspectives, and reflections from our, you know, our positionalities. And so I really think, like, you know, the way in which our leadership is manifesting is increasing, but also the way in which we recognize that leadership changes in where and how we're communicating and interfacing with other governments. And so the more that we can create those Indigenous kind of spaces, the more that we can enable, you know, a place where our folks feel safe and where we can communicate, you know, our priorities in the way that makes sense to us. And that relates like very closely to, you know, some of the work that we're doing at the AFN around the development of the AFN National Climate Strategy. And part of the National Climate Strategy is like articulating, you know, a First Nations climate lens and a First Nations approach to, you know, what is effectively climate action, whether through mitigation or adaptation. And a key element of that has been the hosting of national climate gatherings, that the most recent of which we held in September in Fredericton, had about 500 folks there. And really, these are instances of you know, creating space for First Nations to communicate the breadth of climate-related solutions and the action that they're doing in their lands, waters, and territories. And you know, the conversation is very different, and so that is what, like, we're aspiring to do, you know, whether at a domestic or international level, and then seek those opportunities to, like, how do we interface? How do we create spaces that can interface between these different worldviews, these different perspectives, these different systems of knowledge in a way that doesn't require our systems of knowledge to be minimized in order to fit into what is effectively not our way of doing and being. And an elder once told me, you know, the only way, an elder from the Yukon, from Carcross, like, the only way in which you fit like a round peg in a square hole is if you make it smaller. And I think that's kind of emblematic of the environments that we find ourselves in, where, as Angele shared, like, part of the kind of mental and emotional labor is just about justifying why we're in our space, why we're in this space, sorry, and why our knowledge systems are valuable. Despite that growing recognition, we just haven't got to the place where folks, I think, are positioned to understand and unpack some of the kind of challenging assumptions that prevent that meaningful integration that we're aspiring to create.
Great, thanks. So we're going to move on to our final question. So at this point, if anybody has questions from the audience, feel free to start getting them ready because you'll be coming up next. Also, feel free to drop them in the chat. But over to Angele, could you describe your research from COP27? I know you were there, you were on the ground, you were doing some research that we were rushing through ethics, all those types of things to get prepped to be on the ground there. And just how could folks get more engaged and involved in all of this?
Yeah, so our project, Indigenous Climate Leadership and Self-Determined Futures, we recognize that Indigenous people are often the most at risk to the impacts of climate change, and oftentimes, climate policies say like Indigenous ways of being and knowing, Indigenous knowledges are the solutions to climate change. But then Indigenous voices often aren't included in some of these decision-making processes. So we really wanted to highlight in this research how Indigenous people are, doing climate justice in their home communities just by carrying out their own land-based learning practices and traditions on the land. And then how, there are some prominent Indigenous voices at the national and international level. And so we really wanted to, with this project, interview to look at things from a gendered lens, the importance of like revitalizing Indigenous languages, and also, understanding climate change from a One Health perspective. And so my research is mostly focused on looking at the gendered lens of climate justice and Indigenous climate leaders. So while I was at COP, I ended up staying like this is, I don't know if this is methodological, but I ended up staying like in the same hotel, the same space as some of these Indigenous organizations like the NDN Collective, the Indigenous Climate Action, and a delegation from Ganawage. And so I developed relationships with some of these folks at previous COPs, and I was able to explain the research to them and how we're trying to uplift the voices of Indigenous people, especially youth and women and gender diverse folks. So I ended up doing about 7 or 8 interviews. The reason I say or 8 is because some of them ended up being focus groups where I had like a group of prominent Indigenous climate leader women want to do like a group discussion. So we had like a group discussion. I ended up meeting some youth at the AFN gathering, at the COP gathering, and then interviewing them while they were at the COP15 gathering in Montreal. I ended up interviewing climate leaders from my region when I got back home from COP27. So just trying to incorporate as many youth, the women, gender diverse voices in our interviews. And I think where I want to go to next in the research project is getting more elders and various knowledge keepers involved. And so what we're going to be doing with the research now is we're going to be holding some gatherings. And so we hope to have we're going to have like a workshop in the spring, but we're actually going to be having a large gathering in the fall, which we're planning for, where we will invite elders and youth to have intergenerational knowledge sharing discussions. And we'll use that towards our research. We're also, want to use different types of media, so different audio, visual, at some point, maybe focusing on specific Indigenous climate leaders and making a documentary about 2 or 3 of them. So there's different directions that this research can go, and also, you know, that this research should be for the benefit of Indigenous people, especially from, you know, Canada, since this is where our research is based. So I'm hoping at some point we can also have a policy impact, you know, at the international and national level, just by showing what Indigenous knowledges people have and how that can be used towards, you know, climate justice and solutions to the climate crisis. Yeah, so I guess that's.
Yeah, can I add one piece there?
Yeah.
Well? I think like in that last kind of frame that you shared, like part of what is needed and part of like what we're endeavoring to do is like obviously amplify all of the pieces that Angele shared, but equally important is like, how do we, instead of kind of direct the gaze of research more at Indigenous peoples, how do we look at also like the kind of federal or international institutional structures that prevent the expression of Indigenous peoples within these spaces? And so, like, you know, it's very common for us to say like, well, what are the ways in which Indigenous peoples need to fit? But it's not as common to really like unpack the ways in which, you know, whether it's federal climate policy or whether it's international climate policy, is like reinforcing the root causes of these problems that like continue to harm Indigenous peoples and their lands, waters, and territories, and, you know, continue to uphold assumptions of like economic systems that, you know, are predicated on that extraction and violence. They're predicated on those relationships with the land that are creating the imbalance that our elders are sharing. And so really thinking through like, how do we position our work as like obviously amplifying and supporting, you know, Indigenous led solutions, but also how do we position it in a way that, you know, begins to kind of unpack and deshackle the ways in which, you know, colonial institutions and policy are actually limiting the success of Indigenous peoples. And, you know, there are multiple examples of that we can think of in the context of adaptation policy. Like, how did, you know, the legacy of the Indian Act and where and how our communities are structured influence their sensitivity to extreme weather? And like, what are the ways in which that, you know, policies like that actually reproduce the kind of vulnerability? And I use vulnerability in the context of, you know, adaptation or adaptive capacity is used often as kind of an addition or equaling between vulnerability, exposure, and sensitivity. And that exposure and sensitivity is institutionally manufactured through, you know, pieces like the Indian Act and others. And so how do we also just use our time and space to unpack some of that?
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. I see that we just have a handful of folks left online. Many have sent much appreciation and for sharing and all that you contributed today. And so I'm just going to see if there are any comments online. Yeah, Matt.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much, both of you. That was really great to listen to your responses to the questions. Just coming off of the last points, I was just curious to bring it back to the COPs. Do you see any examples of where that unshackling is happening within the context of the negotiations? Like, was the language around loss and damage helpful? Has any space opened up within the sort of meeting rooms where the high level decision making is happening for Indigenous groups that are present there? Like, is anything evolving in a good direction in this regard that you were just speaking to? I mean, your examples, Graeme, last ones were in the Canadian context, but just to kind of bring it back there, or either way, I'm just curious if you've seen any positive developments in this regard, or also just your insights on like how to work towards this. Because I did some work on this myself going back a few years now, but I found the same thing at the, like, not only Indigenous groups, but any transnational groups just don't have, like, if your identity is not within in a sort of Western framework of what a nation state is, you don't have a voice at the table where decisions are being made about you. So how do we figure out ways to break down this system that is excluding so many groups that are living on the front lines of climate? So just either of your insights on that would be wonderful, but I also don't want to take up too much more time. So yeah, thanks. Thanks again.
Yeah, I'm happy to have, so thank you for the question, Matt. Happy to toss it over. Graeme, I see you smiling and nodding, so do you want to take that on?
Yeah, sure. I can respond in a few different ways and appreciate that question, Matt. And I think like the core of the problem is like the deep commitment to decision making afforded to, you know, UN recognized parties. And like until we really kind of get to that place where like our nations aren't recognized at the decision table, you know, we may not be able to influence, you know, final decisions and the opportunities presented that we've outlined. And like loss and damage is a perfect example, right? Like the entry points that Indigenous peoples have been given is generally through what's considered non-economic losses. You know, basically non-economic losses are those losses that can't be quantified economically, you know, whether we're talking about loss of cultural sites or sacred sites, et cetera, loss of, you know, the connection to salmon or to caribou, depending where you are and like your identity. But that the connection of those conversations to the overall framework of loss and damage has not moved forward. I kind of think that first, obviously, these multilateral processes move slow. And so if we like look at the progress in the kind of sister convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, we see the creation of the Article 8J working group functioned essentially for 10 years. In the new global biodiversity framework, we begin to see like, you know, references to the rights of Indigenous peoples in a more active way. The conversation now is like, what do we do with that group, that Article 8J working group? In a similar context, like I see the progress from the rights recognition in the preambular language in 2015 to the creation of this facilitative working group, which is that first constituted body between Indigenous peoples and parties. And like the continuation of that, in my mind, is like, how do we move forward towards models of enhanced participation that reflect and distinguish Indigenous peoples? And there are different models, right? You know, the permanent participants at the Arctic Council is an example of like how to elevate the role of Indigenous peoples. It's obviously not at the decision-making table in a formal way, but it is an important recognition. So how do you leverage the facilitative working group moving forward? I think like my biggest challenge within this space or within the space is like the inability to take a step back and like unpack the ways in which the concepts that are being discussed originate in like certain frameworks of thinking. And, you know, you can do that in the context of like the overall temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. The overall temperature goal is to, you know, keep global warming under 2 degrees and take all efforts to reduce it under 1.5. Really what that does is it reduces the climate problem to the reduction of emissions. And we see from the example of Angele and hydroelectric dams, like, yeah, sure, they may reduce emissions and it may produce a relatively clean form of power, but we know all of the massive impacts for the land and water surrounding. We know the methylmercury release that'll be caused long-term. And so like an inability to like unpack these problems from that lens, that multi-dimensional lens, lends us to, you know, half solutions. final example that I'll share is the concept of net zero, right? Net zero emissions has essentially been reduced to like an economic calculation, or an anthropogenic emission calculation, which is to say net zero is equal to when our anthropogenic emissions are offset by our anthropogenic sinks. What this does is it allows Canada, and not to harp on this again, but allows Canada to say, we're going to produce more oil and gas in 2050 than we do now, but we're going to be net zero because we're going to offset all of that production somehow, or we're not going to count all of the burning of those fossil fuels because it's done in other countries. And like the ways of thinking and the like perverseness of this justification is absolutely bonkers. And so that is like, I think the clash between our systems of knowledge and how they manifest. And so really the first step that I see, and I don't know if this is done really, effectively, is taking that step back. How do we take that step back, that pause, and start to unpack these concepts through that lens of like, what do you mean by that? And how is that influencing what you think? And sorry, just a final thought. Part of the connection to the party-driven process is through this concept of constructive ambiguity, which essentially enables parties to implement, their respective policies according to their national circumstances. That system necessitates a level of vagueness. And so even within that system and that vagueness, we have different interpretations from different parties because those interpretations are created to be dependent on national circumstances, which is inherently problematic, especially if we're talking about kind of a global system. So sorry for going long.
No, that's great. Thank you. Angele, anything to add?
Sorry, I'm gonna like plug my book really quick, but yesterday, like we were having discussions about one of the chapters I contributed to on, restoring Indigenous sovereignty and also restoring Indigenous economies of care. And I think, from my experience of working in the labor movement and trying to understand the labor market and, constantly like calculating these like statistics of job losses and job gains and what that means for just transition, and measuring everything by GDP. Like coming from Alberta, there was this pride in like, 30% of our GDP, it comes from oil and gas. 6% of our jobs, our direct jobs come from oil and gas. And then there's like another like 10% of indirect jobs. And so there's this like measuring that takes place of our economy, and this idea that our economy has to constantly grow, right? Mm-hmm. Like a growth in jobs, a growth in profits. And these profits go to a small few. And it's not the right model for an economy. Like if you look at how Indigenous people used to traditionally live, like we have rules and laws, like you only take from the land what you need. You don't just take and take and take until it's empty and dead. And that's the economic system that we're following right now, is this growth economy based on profits that only benefit a few. Why don't we have an economy built on like the principle of health? People should be able to have housing and food and decent work. But instead we're like focusing on this growth and these, like I've worked among labor economists, and we used to go to these economic conferences constantly, and we would just be shown graphs and graphs and graphs. And at a certain point, I'm like, they're just making shit up. Like these projections, like these guys, they think they're doing good math, but they're not. They're like, they're looking at the same statistics we are. And I'm like, they just make up what they want. And they're propped up as like so knowledgeable and brilliant, like, oh, we've calculated this and that. But, our elders would laugh at them. Like, that's silly. Why are we killing the earth? That's killing us. We're killing animals and plants that we rely on to live and breathe. Like, we're killing the water. We need water to live. And so this economy is backwards. Like it doesn't benefit most human life. And so to like what Graeme was saying, like this, we need to question the system. You know, I think, yes, jobs, business, that will always have a place, but what about health? What about happiness? What about basic human rights? Right? Like my clothing I'm wearing today probably comes from a woman who like is making $1 a day in Bangladesh. But if I was able to, I would make clothing from like the way my people traditionally made it. But we're stuck in this economy that is not benefiting anyone. And so I think we really need to question, you know, who's doing the math and science. And I would rather rely on elders. Like right now, there's a bunch of discussion about carbon capture. And, you know, the Pathways Alliance is really pushing that. But the science is not there. They think this will be a good solution. There's solar geoengineering, which will change the way our atmosphere works. Because we're too lazy to change and think about a different world. We're willing to change the sky and the weather because we need, you know, nice clothes and cars. Like it doesn't make sense. It's just a backwards economy. And I think one of, you know, there was a recent Nobel Prize winner who is an economist, I think from India, who said, we shouldn't be measuring our economies based on GDP. This is nuts. These are old measurements. Like, why are we still doing this? So I think we need to reconsider what we consider a good life, what we consider a good economy. Yeah, so, and I think Indigenous ways of knowing are better than some of these other systems of knowing.
Great. Thank you so much. Just noting the time here. I don't know if there are any last comments from either Angele or Graeme before I wrap things up. No?
I feel like
Okay.
Angele ended that in a good way.
I was going to say, I was like, what a powerful way to end this off. And I really do want to thank you, Angele, and you, Graeme, for sharing your insights and thoughts with us today, and for being here with us for this event, for our Climate Change Month series of 2023. 2 things to plug, because I wouldn't be a good director if I wasn't plugging events for the center, that we have 2 upcoming research seminars, Hearted Centered Research and Anishinaabe Ontology by Dr. Leora Gainsworth, which is happening on Monday, March 13th at 7 p.m., as well as Navigating Water System Change with the Ebb and Flow of Indigenous Knowledges with Rachel Arsenal on Monday, March 20th at noon, which both, the first one is going to be hybrid, the second will be virtual. For more information, please see the cycle website, and you can register for events and check out and join our listserv. But again, thank you both so much. I am jealous that you got to go and experience COP over in Egypt, but it sounds like there were a lot of really rewarding and enriching discussions, and thank you for sharing those with us today. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, we got you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.